William Lane Craig is a Christian apologist, and he, like most of his ilk, makes his money preaching to the choir, the core fundamentalist Christians who already believe what he has to say, so he doesn't have to work very hard presenting a convincing argument, and that's a good thing because critics recognize that what he says is largely laughable. As with virtually all evangelical apologists, he doesn't even try to show that what he believes is actually true. He simply assumes it a priori because his primary audience, the believers, will never call him on it. Unfortunately for him, his critics don't blindly buy into his statements of faith. They demand evidence and reason and a critical evaluation of his arguments, none of which William Lane Craig has. This makes him largely a laughingstock outside of the evangelical Christian community. I can think of no freethinker or atheist or skeptic that has expressed even the slightest bit of respect or admiration for Craig or his apologetics. Of course, this doesn't stop him, because his prey aren't the rational-minded, but the gullible theists who buy his books and watch his videos and slurp all of his nonsense down their uncritical gullets. So I came across a video of his. It's a little over a year old, but I'm still seeing theist bloggers hoisting it up on their shoulders like it's the greatest apologetic video of all time. In the video, Craig makes 7 arguments for the existence of God, and all of these arguments are just awful. I thought it would be fun to take on these 7 claims and see just how terrible they actually are. His first argument, why is there something instead of nothing, demonstrates just why Christian apologists will never gain any traction with rational people. They cannot see the utter fallacy of this claim, and thus cannot understand why people refuse to accept it. It's based upon 5 statements that I will now put up for everyone to see. By the time you get to the end of the second statement, your logical alarm bells ought to be going off. He's simply making the assertion that he's right, therefore he's right. This is not, regardless of what he wants you to think, a proper logical syllogism, even though it has a valid form. It suffers from false premises, and therefore draws a faulty conclusion. He's hoping that his audience doesn't pay much attention or accept his claims. So let's take a look at another example of this. These 3 statements are in proper logical form. They're essentially what he's saying. All right, let's look at these. If the streets are wet, it has rained recently. The streets are wet, therefore it has rained recently. Now, if you don't think about it too much, that kind of makes some sense. Of course, the conclusion here may be completely false because the first premise is not necessarily true. There are other explanations for the street being wet. Someone could have sprayed them with a hose. A river could have overflowed its banks. Someone could have spilled their drink. There are many, many possibilities for the wet condition of the street. Likewise, Craig is simply asserting that there's a single cause without demonstrating that such a cause even exists. If we look at premise 2, we see he's just making an unjustified claim without a shred of evidence to back it up. He could have just as easily said, well, the explanation must be Mickey Mouse, or leprechauns, or Bigfoot. There is no rational reason to come to that belief outside of his blind faith that such a belief is warranted. This is an example of fallacious thinking, which I think you'll find runs through just about all of Craig's apologetics. Specifically in this case, it's an example of the argument from ignorance where, when stumped for an actual answer, he just invents something that's emotionally comforting out of whole cloth and argues that this must be the answer. So why is there something rather than nothing? The answer is, we just don't know. Not knowing is a perfectly valid answer. It doesn't say that we'll never know, only that, at the moment, we have insufficient evidence to come up with a rational answer. But people of Craig's ilk are afraid of not knowing. Therefore, they simply make something up. That's just not rational. Number 2, the law of cause and effect. This one is always a joke, but I think in Craig's case, it's even worse. It asserts that for every effect, there is a cause. Of course, it gives God a pass, being an uncaused cause, and if you can do that, you can just make a purely natural uncaused cause and skip the whole idea of God. It is claimed that the cause must be greater than the effect, but I think that we can all find cases where that's just not true. For example, if I take a snowball and roll it down a mountain during the winter and it causes a massive avalanche, the cause is certainly not greater than the effect. In science, we understand that there are other factors, of course, but this disproves Craig's very simplistic means of thinking. In reality, this just demonstrates Craig's problems. Either he doesn't understand this and is an idiot, or he does understand this and is dishonest. Which side is it, Craig supporters? One thing he and other apologists of his ilk ignore is that the laws of cause and effect are inherently a part of the natural laws that govern this universe. That doesn't necessarily mean they govern all universes. And since we're talking about an event that kicked off our own universe, that means we cannot rely on our own physical laws to apply. Craig employs fallacious claims, usually tailored to his ignorant audience, that appeal on an emotional level, not an intellectual one. To look at his claims another way, it's like saying that we can hold a driver in Los Angeles accountable to the speed limits in Bombay, India, because speed limits must be universal. Unfortunately for him, that's not necessarily the case, and it's completely ludicrous for him to state otherwise. This is all conjecture, of course, and I'm not claiming this is how it actually happened, but I'm not Craig. Whereas the apologist says, I don't know, therefore God, the rational person is satisfied to stop with, I don't know. He's making a claim of fact for which he has no evidence. All I have to do is point out other possibilities that oppose his conclusions, and I can send him back to the drawing board. Unfortunately, Craig won't acknowledge anything that falls outside of his fanatical faith. Number 3. The incredible complexity of the universe. The sad thing is, Craig and his followers are pretty ignorant when it comes to understanding the world around them. They are largely uneducated and ignorant of science, and therefore assume, based on that ignorance, that we cannot explain the universe that surrounds us in any kind of rational manner. This is, as with so many other arguments, an example of the argument from ignorance. They don't understand it, therefore they claim only God could have done it. This isn't new to Craig. He's one of a long line of ignorant and dishonest apologists who have asserted that we can never know how the things around us came to be. Unfortunately, even when science explains, with evidence, how we can learn about nature and work out its mysteries, these apologists will usually keep repeating the same demonstrably disproven claims again and again. They're not interested in the reality, only the religious validating fantasy. Now, I'm not in a position in this short video to explain the mysteries of the universe. That's something that's easily done at any library. But claims of the evolution of the eye, of the operation of the bombardier beetle, and many others have been soundly disproven over the years. Yet apologists never admit they are wrong. They just keep spouting the same old tired nonsense to the fanatically faithful. Number 4. Objective morality. I've already done a video on objective morality and therefore won't spend much time here. This is one of the most popular apologetic arguments around, and probably one of the weakest and the least intellectually defensible. Essentially, Craig assumes without evidence that whatever happens to be in the Bible is true, and anything that falls outside the Bible is false, and thus, because he has the truth and nobody else does, he wins. He, like virtually all theists, does things ass backwards. They start with the conclusion they want, that the Bible is the Word of God, and work backwards, cherry-picking evidence or making faith claims to support it. That's not how intellectual reasoning works. You start with the evidence and let it lead you to whatever conclusion it supports. If we do that, we find that morality is not handed down from on high, but it's something that we as humans create for ourselves. This might not make theists happy or comfortable, but since when is reality predicated on your emotional well-being? Number 5. Anselm's Ontological Argument. Now this is a very common argument, but utterly laughable to anyone who stops to think about it for a moment. Essentially, it says that God is the greatest entity that can possibly be conceived, and therefore he must exist because we can conceive of him. Now I'll stop for a moment to let the stupidity of that statement sink in. A more outlandish, absurd, and ridiculous argument is pretty hard to imagine, but that must mean it's true, right? Well, no. Even back in St. Anselm's time, people were pointing out just how stupid this claim really was. One of his contemporaries challenged Anselm to find an idealized island, greater than which no one can imagine. Others, such as Thomas Aquinas, believed that man was inherently incapable of imagining the greatest of God anyway. Therefore, Anselm's argument fails. The problem with his claims are many. I can imagine all sorts of maximally perfect things that simply do not exist in the real world. I can imagine flying cars. I can imagine amazing computers. There's no end to things I can't dream up with improvements for which they aren't actually really real. But there's another problem too. Some have suggested that dreaming up perfect things other than God aren't really following the same argument. Therefore, any claims made about non-God objects are irrelevant. Okay, we can play that game too. I can imagine a God that is far greater than the Christian God. Frankly, the Christian God is kind of a dick. I find him capricious and obnoxious and downright evil. He's certainly not the maximally great deity that can be imagined. Further, every single non-Christian religion out there believes that they have a superior deity to the Christian God because none of them believes the Christian God exists. A real deity is infinitely better than a make-believe deity. Thus, no matter how you look at it, Anselm's ontological argument is a bust. Number 6. The resurrection. Craig uses this claim based on 3 arguments. First, that there's evidence of the empty tomb. So where is that empty tomb? Who knows? There is no tomb that anyone can point to and demonstrate via any form of objective evidence that it belonged to Jesus. In fact, no one has yet demonstrated with evidence that Jesus ever actually existed. We have to examine these claims critically. Faith, no matter how strongly professed, cannot play a role in determining objective fact. Therefore, with no evidence to back it up, Craig's first argument falls. Likewise, the second argument, that post-mortem appearances reported in the Bible, also falls apart. There's no independent corroboration of these events. In fact, there's no independent corroboration that Jesus ever lived. Not one single contemporary demonstrable eyewitness ever claimed to have seen Jesus, nor any of his miraculous prestidigitations. Finally, he claims that the disciples believed Jesus had risen from the dead. So what? Let's take a step back and look at this in another context. Modern Muslims believe that Muhammad rode off into the heavens atop a winged stallion. It's recorded in their holy book, the Quran. It was testified by Muhammad's disciples. In fact, they built the Dome of the Rock right over the spot they believed it happened. Is this sufficient reason to accept that it actually happened? Christians would say no, yet use the exact same kind of arguments and the exact same blind faith to justify their belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Hypocrisy, anyone? In the end, all Craig is arguing for is faith being support for his faith, which is circular and absurd. He has faith that what the Bible says is true, and he uses that to support his claims that his faith is therefore valid. Around and around and around he goes. Where his insanity stops, no one knows. And finally, number 7, experiential. Finally, we get to his last point, where he claims that because people have experiences with the divine, that the divine actually exists. At issue here, of course, is that nobody can actually demonstrate they've had any real, tangible experiences with the divine. Oh, sure, they may have had experiences, but they cannot demonstrate that the divine had anything to do with them, or that the divine exists in the first place. It's about as silly as saying that staring at a stoplight proves you have magic powers that makes it turn green. There are plenty of theists who arbitrarily assign a cause they cannot demonstrate to an experience that they have, even when they have more logical and rational explanations for that event. This is the epitome of the fallacy from ignorance, where one makes a claim because they cannot think of another solution, or they have an emotional investment in one answer that they dare not question. The fact remains that just because your sports team won the big game, that's not proof that a God exists. Teams have been winning games since time immemorial without supernatural intervention. Just because something you identify as unusual happens, something you cannot come up with an immediate rational explanation for, that doesn't mean you can go traipsing off down the primrose path into La La Land. In reality, None of these reasons ought to convince anyone. They are evidence for nothing more than the fact that Craig and his followers are credulous, gullible idiots. Anyone who stops for a few seconds to look at any of these propositions logically is going to come to the conclusion that they fall apart under even the most cursory evaluation. They require that someone believe the arguments are true before evaluating whether the arguments are true. The believer can only come at them from a position of faith because anyone with half a rational brain in their head will take one look and laugh. For those who buy into these claims, maybe you ought to take a step backward and see if you'd accept the same claims if someone changed the name of the god involved or inserted Bigfoot into the claim. If one is true and the other false, just because of the entity involved, you can be sure you're being irrational. I doubt this will matter to most fanatical believers, though, which is what makes faith so pathetic.